Welcome to When the Clock Struck Zero, the year 2000. Comedian Conan O'Brien had a recurring sketch on his late night television show, which aired on NBC called In the Year 2000. O'Brien and a guest would dress up in futuristic garb, position flashlights under their chins, and imagine in comic fashion what the world will look like in the year 2000. Those of us who were around back then remember what it was like. 25 years later, we still hear the echoes of Y2K. Before all of us had smartphones in our pockets, it was a big deal for any household to own a personal computer. Not that there was much to do with computers in those days. This was years before the launch of YouTube and social media. Aside from the exorbitant cost of computers, which could run in the thousands of dollars, the internet was in its infancy and access was not widely available. According to the US Census, it was not until 2001 that most American households reported owning a computer or having internet access. Gradually, though, computers and the internet became both more affordable and efficient. They became ubiquitous, specifically in commerce and government. Having a website with a www and a .com was a novelty and eventually a necessity. As we counted down to the year 2000, there was growing concern among experts behind the scenes about a defect in the programming code that powered many computers. See, the year in many computers was represented with 2 digits. The fear was that after 1999, computers would reset to the year 1900 and throw the world into chaos. In a 1995 email, computer programmer David Eddy coined the term Y2K, a name which stuck, not just to describe the computer bug, but the lead up to the year 2000 and beyond. Y2K was supposed to be the future, a new dawn. Though not technically the beginning of a new millennium, the year 2000 was notable for several other reasons, which we're going to talk about today. Today we present When the Clock Struck Zero, the year 2000. So my name is Professor Amezcua, and I'd like to welcome our usual panel. I'd like to welcome Dr. Stephen Lopez, teaches history at San Jacinto College Online, and Professor Will Parent, who teaches government at San Jacinto College Online. So we thought we would talk about some of the things that were notable from this period of time, which was, I repeat, 25 years ago now, and get the thoughts from our panel who were around back then like I was. And let's begin by talking about this whole Y2K bug or hysteria or whatever you want to call it. So let's start off with Dr. Lopez. Dr. Lopez, what do you remember about Y2K?
Thank you. I remember the panic of planes falling from the sky, everything shutting down, the world was going to end, the famous acronym Teotihuacan, the end of the world as we know it, a popular song by REM, and the billions of dollars that was spent worldwide to upgrade the computers because of the 2-digit code. People feared, you had preppers buying canned goods, heading out to the wilderness or their bunkers in order to survive. This idea that electricity will be shut down, no water, no electricity, and in the end, not much happened.
Professor Parent, what do you remember about Y2K?
Well, thank you so much. So, as an 18-year-old in high school, I was really excited. This was obviously the way most people view it, a new century, a lot of optimism. In terms of Y2K in particular, there were concerns that street lights would be out. I remember my mom and other family members telling me, "Don't be out on the road right at midnight. There could be some chaos." But that never panned out in terms of major issues with computers not being able to transition to a new century there. And so the feeling was of real excitement for myself and many of my friends for a new century, a new era. Later that year, we would have a presidential election. There was excitement about that as well that we'll discuss.
Yeah, another thing that I think about the year 2000 and it being beyond just a technical issue, it was almost like the perfect storm for a conspiracy theorist, wasn't it? It was, this is the moment, these are going to be the end times. For those those folks who believe in like things like the rapture. They believe that this was a convenient time for us to be raptured. And the same way that we react with annoyance today when our internet is out or something like that. Imagine the thought of everything that is now connected to this new thing called the internet and to computers potentially being frozen. And that's the thing that I most remember. Even though we mentioned the year 2000 really isn't the beginning of a new millennium, isn't it? I hate to be that guy, but it's the end of the last millennium. One of the other things that I remember is just the high times, the high economic times that we're living through. And I want to throw it first to Professor Parent this time. What were some of the things that had really kickstarted the economy? Because it seemed like if you wanted to become an overnight millionaire, this was the time to do it.
Absolutely. So much like right now, obviously, we see with artificial intelligence, that was the case a little over 25 years ago with technology and computers in particular. They were becoming the standard. And so many people in Silicon Valley made millions, made ultimately billions of dollars during this time. And we were running budget surplus as a country. A budget surplus is a situation where the country brings in more in revenue than it spends. And economists in the late 90s were predicting budget surpluses for the foreseeable future. But of course, that did not pan out. We know that soon after the New Year's Eve in 2000, as we moved into a new year, that the economy would begin to struggle soon after. But the optimism that was enjoyed by many Americans in the late 90s going into that new year ultimately would not come to fruition there. And it really has kind of changed and poisoned our politics to a large degree. Now we're in the midst of a government shutdown, and there are major questions about what to do with entitlement programs. And yet, just a quarter century ago, this country was had a much different trajectory.
Dr. Lopez, do you want to chime in?
Yeah. As Professor Parent mentioned, technology, computers, the development of the World Wide Web, this is where we see the term globalization, where now businesses can conduct themselves internationally from one setting. It's almost a 24-hour type of business world. You're screened into markets overseas, which really contribute to the worldwide economy. Businesses promoted their companies in a series of these .coms, selling the business. However, at the time, many people were reluctant to purchase online or uh, didn't have access to computers or the web. And eventually we see the .bomb episodes in the future.
Yeah, what I remember most about this period of time is just the possibility of coming up with the next new thing and reaching new markets. This is around the time that a little known entrepreneur named Jeff Bezos starts a online book selling company that eventually becomes Amazon and becomes, the all everything company. But going back to the political aspect of this, this really wasn't, deficit reduction and tax increases is typically not popular politics, right? I mean, Democrats and Republicans alike like to, talk about budgets, but it's not very salient. But this was almost something that was forced onto Bill Clinton, wasn't it? Because Robert Rubin and some of the people who he chose as his cabinet members, that this was something that was needed when he was elected, and he almost reluctantly came around to this. But it had great success. I mean, it's difficult to imagine, as I think we're in the trillions of dollars now in both deficit and debt, for us to, at the end of the year, have a budget surplus and a balanced budget altogether. But the quick path to wealth and then government responsibility are two of the things that I remember most from this period. Pop culture. A lot of the influences that started around this time that in fairness probably were not new or derived from something else too are coming back. Y2K is kind of a nostalgic nod to the style and the music and the art from that period of time. So what do we remember from that period of time? I see the Yankees logo up here. So where should I start? Dr. Lopez.
With the new technology, the cell phone craze, now you have access to this immediate communication network with your cell phone. In addition, cameras on new sites, new types of cameras on phones. Uh, it's sort of outpacing the consumer, how fast the technology was developing. One model would come out and someone would have a different model just in within months. Same thing with computers. It's just this rapid explosion of this technology as we all try to sort of keep up with the latest change with that technology, and made sort of a focus on telephones and technology rather than having face-to-face conversations or meeting people. Now, much of that is done through telecommunications and phone services.
As parent, you wanted to share a story about your first device, right?
Absolutely there. So we talk about cell phones and how much, and of course, Dr. Lopez referenced this, how much of our lives is glued to that screen, our cell phone there. And um, when my mom purchased me a cell phone there in 2000, I remember thinking at the time, why do I need this? I've got a home telephone. I lived in an apartment. I had a pager. There was no reason to have a cell phone, I thought. And yet, fast forward just a few years later, or in this case, 25 years later, and so much of our lives is on our cell phone. I can't imagine that. And yet, just a quarter century ago, these were very primitive. You couldn't watch videos on them. You could play you can play just a handful of games on them. They were rather primitive, like I said. There wasn't much you could do other than literally call someone, and the reception oftentimes wasn't all that great. Some other things I want to point out here is Survivor. I realize a lot of people like reality television. I am not one of those people, but nonetheless, this is where you begin to see more and more programming dedicated to reality television. Of course, today you'd be hard pressed to find anything other than reality television on a lot of our major stations there. I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge Destiny's Child there, formed and established right here in our hometown of Houston, Texas. And of course, Beyonce was one of the founding members. They are one of the largest musical acts during this time, late 90s, moving into the early aughts there. And of course, as much as I hate to say it, the New York Yankees. They had won the 1996 World Series, and then they would go on to win in 98, 99, and 2000. If there's any silver lining, who were their two aces on that team? No other than Houstonians Roger Clemens and Andy Pettit. That's right, San Jacinto College students and student athletes for the baseball program. So I guess we were able to connect all that somehow back to our hometown here. But it's really interesting to see how a lot of these things that we talk about, pop culture, the Yankees, the Lakers would win their first of three championships for that century in the year 2000, repeating in 01 and 02 as well. But so much of this is still with us to this day, whether it's cell phones or reality television, Beyonce, or in this case, the lasting legacy of one of the premier sports franchises in this country, the New York Yankees, and their nearly 30 World Series championships there. So all of these have had quite a bit of lasting power.
Yeah, and going back to the cell phones, now we do so much on our phones. We bank, we summon an Uber, we take our course assignments on the phone. But back then, they, like you said, there was no texting at the time. There was no internet access. And I don't know if you guys remember that you had to guard your minutes because it was an expensive thing to call somebody. You would prefer not to call someone on your cell phone unless it was an emergency because it was so expensive back in the day. Now, of course, there are so many reports about people who don't even come close to using their minutes because we prefer to text. Regarding reality TV, you're absolutely right that not only did Survivor come out, but we had Big Brother and we had The Weakest Link, and American Idol was popular during this time. And absolutely, this continues to be kind of the MO for a lot of our broadcast networks because it is a lot less expensive to do reality TV than it is a scripted show with writers and actors and all that. So this continues to be such an important thing. And back then, I think one of the other things that was unique was the monoculture, that we all watched the same things every night because we didn't have Netflix. We didn't have all of the different options. So it was a common thing on a Monday morning after an episode to come back and talk about what happened on Survivor, the day before. On music, Destiny's Child, obviously one of the big standouts from that period of time. But if you were like me, you probably had on in your tape deck or your CD player, you probably had some pop punk like Green Day and Blink 182, bands like that. You had the boy bands. The boy bands were still at their imperial phase, and Britney Spears and Outkast. Outkast was a big hip hop group from Atlanta, Georgia, who to this day they continue to have influence. And yes, the Lakers, you mentioned the iconic status that those teams and those players, namely Shaquille O'Neal and Kobe Bryant, still continue to have so much relevance today. One of the major events, kind of pivoting here, was the alien. I'll just call it the Alien Gonzalez saga. So, Alien Gonzalez was not captured, but rescued at sea by the Coast Guard. His mother and relatives had made the dangerous journey from Havana to Florida, which is about 70 miles, if I'm not mistaken. In the course of the journey, the mother passed away and they found the child. And let's take it from there. What happened after Alien Gonzalez was rescued? What did that kick off? I'll start with you, Professor Grant, this time.
So once Elion is brought to the U.S., he is taken in by extended family. His father is still back in Cuba. There becomes a custody battle for Elion, and eventually it's ruled here in the U.S. that he's got to go back to his father. And so what you see here in this image is a U.S. federal agent retrieving Elion from his relatives in Florida. And of course, Florida has a sizable Cuban American population. In 1959, Fidel Castro took power in Cuba. He was a communist. And of course, this is during the Cold War, this ideological struggle between the US and the Soviet Union for control on the world stage. And so, as a result of Castro taking power in Cuba as a communist, working very closely with the Soviet Union. Of course, I don't want to get too thick into the weeds here, but the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, with the placement of nuclear weapons just 90 miles from Florida in Cuba, there were many Cubans who fled Castro's regime to the US and primarily settled in the state of Florida. And they were anti-communist. Many of them had lost all of their belongings as a result of fleeing Castro's taking power in Cuba. And so many of these Cuban Americans supported politicians, and in this case, the Republican Party, because it was seen as having a tougher stand towards communism and specifically Fidel Castro. So Bill Clinton is president. He is a Democrat. He's finishing his second term, which will end in January of 2001. And so this is in the last year of his term in office. And we see that his administration removes Elian from his relatives, and a lot of Cuban Americans in the state of Florida were upset with this. They blamed his administration and, to a larger degree, the Democratic Party. And we'll come back to this issue of Florida and the 2000 presidential election here in the next couple of minutes.
Dr. Lopez, what do you remember about Elian Gonzalez?
Yes, I remember the courts had to step in. Janet Reno, the FBI director, went back and forth. Both sides, the Cuban relatives filed a brief in Miami. The circuit court stepped in and said, well, we're going to decide on legality. His aunt and uncle were the relatives in Miami, also filing a lawsuit. Janet Reno, after consulting with the family, made a decision to honor the Cuban courts and return of Elian. The family in Miami countered that and said, no, well, let's write this out and see if we can appeal. And I believe that's when the government did step in, as you could see here, and forcibly took the child back to his parents.
And these images, if you had shown me this image and time stamped it 2025, it would be believable because these are some of the images that we see today. But I remember just how divided we were on this, and I think it certainly, a lot of people sided with either the Cuban family or the Miami family, but it also became so politicized, didn't it? It was this was a referendum on call it a referendum on democracy or a referendum on communism. And sending Elian back was seen as almost appeasing the communists, and keeping him here was somehow defying Castro. And it seemed like the well-being, the welfare of this little boy, he was 6 years old, almost took second fiddle, I think, to some of these other considerations. And as Dr. Lopez said, at the end, the Miami family had defied the administration, and they just didn't seem any other way, and they just sent agents in. I think it was at dawn, I think, because I remember waking up the next day after this happened and seeing these very images flashed on the news.
And you're absolutely right. This became part of the larger culture wars that split Americans. And it should be noted, as terrifying as this picture looks, Elian, he's grown up. He's now an engineer and a politician in Cuba. Of course, the Cuban government tries to prop him up. And he has really become a symbol in the 25 years since of the staying power of the Cuban government there, even with the death of Fidel and his brother Raul. Cuba still remains a communist government.
Right. And we are in the middle of culture wars today. So this wasn't something that certainly that just started maybe in the last year or 2 years. This has been around, as evidence with Elian Gonzalez. We recently noted or commemorated the 20th anniversary of the bombing of the USS Cole. They were docking right in Yemen when a raft that they didn't see as an immediate threat immediately starts coming in their direction and explodes. And when this happened, it was reported that there'd been an accident, there'd been an explosion on the USS Cole, but it turns out that it had been intentional, that it was an attack, on the US by a group that was not well known back then called Al-Qaeda. Now, let's start with Dr. Lopez on this one. What do you remember about the USS Cole bombing?
Initially, the authorities believed it was an accident. As you said, somehow an explosion took place within the destroyer itself. But just after a few days, it was revealed that this was a terrorist attack that was planned. It was a small boat carrying 1,000 pounds of TNT. A quick investigation also revealed this may have been the work of a terrorist organization, as you mentioned, Al-Qaeda. 17 sailors were killed and about 37 were injured. The crew manned and did their best to keep the destroyer afloat, and also try to provide aid and comfort to those who were injured and those who had died. You could see the 40-foot wide gap in the ship itself. It did take a few days for the Clinton administration to realize this was not an accident. This was a planned attack, and sort of caught policymakers off guard. And the government itself had to quickly put a terrorist task force together to further investigate the incident. It was later revealed that the terrorists were trained by Al-Qaeda in Sudan. The Yemen government, working with U.S. officials, sent a warrant out for the arrest. They did further investigate it, and it was kind of strange to see Yemen working closely with federal officials. One of the reasons is that Yemen did not want to be placed on the terrorist countries of terrorism, needed support from the United States and the West for investment, etc. And eventually, as this sort of broad and more investigation revealed that the perpetrators were later captured and tried in court. The U.S. also investigated that this organization also had links to Osama bin Laden. We know months after the incident, in a famous speech, he mentioned and praising the perpetrators, the terrorists, for the bombing, and sort of kind of woke up America as well as policy officials that the U.S. could be vulnerable internationally.
That was well said. Did you want to add to that, Professor Parent?
Absolutely. So this event takes place on October 12th, 2000. So this is less than a month before the 2000 presidential election. Hindsight's always 2020, but we look at this and we say, wow, policymakers really missed this, because less than 11 months later, of course, we have 9/11, the worst terrorist attack ever on U.S. soil, where we'll lose nearly 3,000 Americans. As Dr. Lopez referenced, there were 17 U.S. sailors who were killed. And Professor Amezcua, I think you captured the mood of many Americans, which they felt caught off guard. However, that should not have been the case, because just 2 years prior, you had the embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, in East Africa. And just 7 years earlier, in 1993, you had the first World Trade Center bombing, all carried out by Al-Qaeda here. And so this plays in once again to the 2000 presidential election. Like I said, just a few weeks later, traditionally the Republican Party is seen as having a tougher stand towards criminal elements, terrorist organizations, in this case Al-Qaeda, and more likely to protect America from attacks. And this essentially is one of the reasons why George W. Bush, running for re-election in 2004, is re-elected, because he's running on the theme that he can keep and prevent and thwart and stop a future terrorist attack there. So it's all fascinating to see all of these events kind of coming to a head in real time in such a short window as we're entering this new century.
That very good points. And we've had these talks before. I think it was when we did our Kennedy talk, and we talked about the loss of America's innocence. And this was almost one of those other moments, because I think we were caught off guard because the economy was roaring. We were in peace. When was the last we had executed a war in Serbia, but it was an air war, and there was very little reason for Americans to believe that we were under any kind of direct threat from anyone. And then, of course, 9/11 tragically happened the year after. But I remember back when I was in high school age, joining the military was seen as an opportunity to go see the world and to earn money for college. And war never really entered the possibility of war really didn't enter the conversation. I think that was a mentality that so many of us had back then, that we were safe. The times when we enter wars, that time is over. So you mentioned we've made reference several times to the election of 2000. One of the closest elections ever, one of the most highly contested elections. And this featured the incumbent vice president, Albert Gore, who had served 8 years as vice president and previously had been a senator from Tennessee, and Texas Governor George W. Bush, the scion of former President George H.W. Bush. So let me just go ahead and turn it over to the panel. Let's talk to Professor Parent first. What do you remember about the campaign for president of 2000?
Yeah, so coming into the election, the general election, there had been a very bitter Republican primary. You had George W. Bush, the sitting governor, had been governor of Texas for the last 6 years. That was the only political office he had ever held prior to running for president in 2000. And his main opponent in the Republican primary was U.S. Senator John McCain. That had gotten very nasty. There were some rumors going about John McCain and one of his adopted daughters. And ultimately, George W. Bush wins a contested Republican primary, and he is a social conservative. He really tries to paint himself as the polar opposite of Bill Clinton. Of course, Clinton was at the time the second president to be impeached because of his relationship with Monica Lewinsky and not being completely candid with investigators about that relationship. And George W. Bush described himself as a born again Christian, someone with very high moral, ethical values that would never have the U.S., in his view, embarrassed like what many people on the right believed Bill Clinton had done, disgracing the Oval Office. Whereas Al Gore, he did have some competition. Bill Bradley, former NBA Hall of Famer in the Democratic primary, but he was seen as almost the incumbent because he had served for 8 years in the Clinton administration as vice president. And President Clinton had delegated real responsibilities to Al Gore there. On many issues, he was at the forefront, whether it be the environment or technology and the internet. Of course, he would later be mocked for some of his statements regarding the internet, but still, nonetheless, he was an active vice president there. And yet, in the campaigning leading up to the general election, Vice President Gore was seen as rather stiff, seen as someone who wasn't perhaps authentic, like George W. Bush, who was seen as someone you could have a beer with, even though he had stopped drinking many years earlier. Should be noted, we talk about October surprises. Well, in the 2000 presidential election, we had a November surprise. And of course, that is that George W. Bush had been arrested in the late 1970s for DUI in the state of Maine. Of course, that did not derail the ultimate result, which is him winning the 2000 election. Of course, spoiler, right?
Yeah.
But nonetheless, this was seen as a real opportunity for Democrats. They were vying for winning the White House for 3 presidential elections in a row, 92, 96, and 2000. And of course, the last time that had occurred, that Democrats had won more than 2 elections in a row, you had to go back to Roosevelt and Truman in his own right in 1948 there. And for Republicans, this was an opportunity to have only the second time in our nation's history a father-son combination. Of course, John Adams and his son, John Quincy Adams, and George W. Bush and his father, George H.W. Bush, sandwiched right in between Bill Clinton there.
Dr. Lopez, what do you remember about the 2000 election?
Compassionate conservatism.
Yeah.
Neither compassion nor conservatism. We'll see a little bit later. But I think both candidates um, sort of were the norm for the period. We're not any major war. Economy was going. There were criticism on both sides. Bush was attacked for his service in the Air National Guard, Texas Air National Guard. He did not serve in Vietnam. Gore's image, very bland. He had to distance himself from Clinton because of the scandal itself. Um, uh, and it pretty much was very close. I think the series of the debates that took place, most of the American people were divided on who was, winning. And then we see that contested election over the state of Florida. Um, but leading up to it, both men did not have to experience any war, any major decisions, even though Professor Parent Gore did, was active as a vice president. Um, but we'll find out on that night how close it was because of the state of Florida and the questions over their ballots.
I remember the Bushisms. I don't know if you guys remember those, that George W. Bush, as a candidate, would frequently mangle, some of the lines. And what I found him to be, though, and he was in many ways the opposite of his father as a campaigner. He was much more relatable. He was a good campaigner. What he lacked in like executive experience, he compensated for, were just affable, just someone who you weren't just predisposed to oppose. What I remember about the Gore campaign was, and I remember hearing a lot of people, the first time I really heard this, is that he wasn't really comfortable in his skin. That, I don't know if you guys remember that he experimented with earth tones, changing up the way that he dressed, that he all of a sudden, even though he in many ways was a very similar candidate to Bill Clinton, kind of the new Democrat class from the South, a baby boomer, he, when he was behind in the polls, fashioned himself as the populist, and you imagine, a Bernie Sanders type as a populist, but son of a senator, went to Harvard and grew up pretty comfortably. It didn't really register, I think, with a lot of people. And it seemed like one small, misstep after another, from the extended kiss with Tipper to the getting too close to George W. Bush during the campaign, or during the debate rather. But perhaps the biggest mistake that he made in retrospect was running away as much as he did from Bill Clinton. I mean, Bill Clinton, despite the impeachments, despite the scandals, was still at an enviable approval rate. And he almost seemed, he rarely mentioned his name. And I think ultimately that's what made this such a close election at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's
Anything
such a
Go
great
ahead.
point there, Professor Amezcua. You talk about how Gore went out of his way not to campaign with Bill Clinton. Of course, we need to understand the context. Looking back 25 years later, we say, well, why wouldn't he do that? He's a two-term president there, who the economy was strong. You're right, we weren't at war. Why it seems like it would be to his advantage to campaign with a sitting president, but Bill Clinton was seen as damaged goods at that point. He had just survived an impeachment where he was not convicted. Of course, to be impeached just means to be accused. He must be convicted by the Senate. And it should be noted that there was a Clinton on the ballot in 2000. It just wasn't Bill Clinton. It was Hillary Clinton. She was running for the U.S. Senate in the state of New York and ultimately would win that Senate seat. There was speculation that she may run for president in 2004. She decided not to do that, sit on the sidelines. But 4 years later, in 2008, she would. And of course, that's a whole different programming that I'm sure we'll provide at some point. But it is interesting to see that Clinton was deeply involved in the 2000 election. It just wasn't so much Bill Clinton, it was Hillary Clinton.
That's true. And it's interesting to, just as a thought experiment, to think about how was Hillary Clinton 16 years after this effect as a presidential candidate in Dade County and in Florida, based on what her husband did, the decisions that his administration made 16 years before that regarding Elian Gonzalez. So let's talk about the big cliffhanger. So the way typically things work is the way typically elections are decided is we tune in on election night. It's states are called little by little. Eventually, one of them gets to 270. The winning candidate will go out and give their victory speech. The losing candidate will give their concession speech, and then we wait for the Electoral College to meet an inauguration. This would not be one of those days. This would be a day when we saw mistakes from the media calling states too early. We saw highly questionable phone calls placed to executives at networks about calling a state too early too. Let's just dive right into it. What happened the day after, or starting with election night and the days after? Let's start with you again, Dr. Parent, Professor Parent.
Well, so you're absolutely right. So I think we'd become accustomed, 10, 11 o'clock at night, we find out who the winner is, we go to bed knowing who the next or the president-elect will be at that point. That was not the case in 2000. So we go several weeks without knowing who's going to win. Of course, it should be noted that when we look at the 2000 presidential election, we have 538 electoral college votes at the time, and it comes down to the state of Florida. And it's unclear who has won Florida and its 25 electoral college votes. At the time, when we look at Florida, Al Gore had 267 electoral college votes, excuse me, and George W. Bush had 246 electoral college votes. So whoever wins the state of Florida will go on to become our next president. There are millions of votes cast in the state of Florida, and it's too close to call. So eventually there's a recount that takes place in the state. Both teams have a team of lawyers, both campaigns, I should say. And this is an image of an election official inspecting a ballot, looking at these, what referred to as these hanging chads. So in Florida, you have a large elderly population, and many of these elderly voters did not fully punch out the ballot. So it was unclear who they intended to vote for. And as you can see, this gentleman has a magnifying glass trying to determine the intent of that particular voter. Ultimately, there is a case, Bush v. Gore, that goes to the U.S. Supreme Court. And in December of 2000, the U.S. Supreme Court decides in a landmark case, 5-4, that the manual recount in the state of Florida must end. And at the time, George W. Bush was up by 537 votes. You can't make this stuff up because, of course, as we just determined and established, there are 538 electoral college votes there. So one of the closest, if not the closest election ever. It's one of a handful of times in our nation's history where a candidate won the popular vote but failed to win the presidential election, because Al Gore did win the popular vote nationwide. Of course, that does not determine the selection of the president. It's based upon whichever candidate receives a majority of electoral college votes. And so George W. Bush, by winning Florida and its winner-take-all system, all 25 electoral college votes, put him over the magic number. The magic number being, of course, 270. He receives 271 to Al Gore's 267. And if Al Gore had won his home state of Tennessee, he would have become our next president. Should be acknowledged that there was a major third-party candidate in Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader was seen as on the left of the political spectrum. He represented the Green Party, and around 100,000 people in the state of Florida voted for Ralph Nader. A lot of people speculate that if Nader had not run for president, then many of those Nader supporters, most likely at least 538 of them, would have voted instead for Al Gore as opposed to George W. Bush. Thus, many people on the left argue that Ralph Nader was the reason why Gore lost Florida and subsequently the 2000 presidential election. Of course, in all fairness, in a close election, you could say anything was the determining factor and the reason why a candidate lost. It's easy to point fingers, but it is intriguing to see what that election looks like in a true head-to-head matchup as opposed to third-party candidates. In most elections, though, you do have third-party candidates. Pat Buchanan, I believe, was on the ballot as well in 2000, as was Ross Perot, I want to say as well. So yeah, that election, I'll never forget it. I'm probably not here today if it weren't for this election because I was just fascinated by what was taking place. I was in Austin at the time, and I remember there was all type of speculation. If Bush becomes the next president, who is this unknown politician named Rick Perry? And of course, he would go on to serve as governor for over 14 years.
Dr.
Lopez, what do you remember about Bush v. Gore?
Yeah, I remember the long night and the coming days and weeks, and who ever heard of things like hanging chads and dimple chads and these butterfly ballots. It was kind of similar in Texas because Texas had something similar to the punch card that Florida did. It was a little bit different. It was a little looked like a little needle. You stuck the card in, and it had a little hole for your candidate, and you pressed it in, and it punched a hole in it. Florida was a little bit different. Same type of card, but they had like this roller with a punch on it, and the voters said they were confused. Some thought they were when they hit the punch that they were voting for Gore, but they wanted Bush, or they thought they were voting Bush, and they ended up voting for Gore because they were confused. As the parents said, especially many of the elderly, and they didn't punch it all the way through. It was, do you count the dimple or the pregnant Chad? What about the one that was hanging? Is that counted? So all this had to sort of, be looked at by the state of Florida. Catherine Harris, the secretary, finally had stepped in and said, no, the count is final. Bush wins. The Supreme Court takes the case. One thing that the Supreme Court did say is that this should not be set as a precedent for further elections, that this is only a one-time thing here. And the fear was that according to the Constitution, we must have a president in place by January. And if this would go any longer, that would not have taken place. So we've learned a lot, I think, from that election. And I think we can go back and kind of, laugh at ourselves and say, really, did this really happen? Yeah, it did. Yeah, it did.
Yeah, what I remember is just the intense division. And some of the books that were written, some of the anecdotes that came out from, the call from Al Gore to George W. Bush retracting the concession, and George W. Bush saying, don't get snippy or something like that in response. But I remember just how fraught the whole situation was during the recounts and the lead up, the protests that were taking place. And I think that was my first kind of entry into intense partisanship, the kind of partisanship that we see today. Also, I think for a lot of people, it was a civics lesson in real time because we learned that counties do elections a different way. The Palm Beach butterfly ballot, the punch cards are different. There were different methods, if any at all, for recounting and different criteria for what kicks off a machine recount versus a hand recount. And later, the Help America Vote Act helped change some of that and replace some of these outdated methods. And finally, I think that, the way that I'd always learned about the courts was that these were apolitical bodies only concerned about enforcing the letter of the law and the Constitution. And I think the way that many people interpret it, especially as Dr. Lopez said, that caveat that this is a one-time decision, can't be used in other instances, and then the closeness of the decision, 5-4, just kind of burst that bubble that the courts are apolitical. I think that many saw it, many to this day consider that one of the more questionable decisions that the Supreme Court has ever rendered. So let's close this up. Closing thoughts. We all lived through it, and I feel like we've taken a step back in time, and or a younger version of ourselves has emerged for these last few minutes. So let's start with Dr. Lopez. Any closing thoughts about the year 2000, about the election, about Alien, about USS Cole, anything like that?
No, I just think that that closing, 99 or 2000, the Y2K, I can remember the celebrations because the time zones start in New Zealand and Australia. So everyone was on edge. Of what's going to happen? Are we going to lose power here, or are planes going to fall down? And then when the clocks did hit midnight out in the Pacific, nothing. People celebrated, and then it crossed over into Asia and Europe, and then into the United States, and people took a deep breath and said, "Nothing's going to happen. We're fine. We're safe. Let's enjoy. Let's move into the decade." Um, so it was a big sort of sigh of relief.
Thank you. Professor Parent.
I can't help but think of this time frame, such a short little window, give or take a year or so, that this was a harbinger of so many other things that would eventually come. A politics that is so polarized. 16 years later, a candidate who fails to win the popular vote but goes on to win the Electoral College. What we see when it comes to the bombing of the USS Cole and Al Qaeda and the war on terror, and still that fear and anxiety Americans have today. Technology and how this has transformed our lives. Today, artificial intelligence, cell phones being at really kind of the heart of so much of our interaction with our friends and communities. All of this really in such a short little window occurred, and it has had that staying power a quarter century later, and it's just fascinating to see this in hindsight.
Thank you. And I don't know that I can add very much beyond what you guys said. I think you guys said it very well. I can't believe that it's been 25 years since these things happened. But I think it helps, if the past is prologue, if what happens in the past kind of informs the future, I think that we can, in any decade, and especially in times we're living in, kind of look back as a reference to see how we got through those periods when we seemed like we were at the mercy of technology, when we're politically divided, when we were debating ideology and the role of family and all that. I think that we can look back, and that can be a guide. So I'd like to thank everybody so much for joining us. I'd like to thank our panel. Again, Dr. Lopez teaches history at San Jac Online, and Professor Parent teaches government at San Jacinto Online, and I teach government at San Jacinto Online. And we welcome your comments or your ideas for future episodes like this. I want to thank you again so much for joining us, and we will talk to you next time.